Alright, a little while ago, just got through watching Srisaket Rungvisai, aka Wisaksawan Gek, successfully defending his WBC Super Flyweight Championship of the World against Iran Diaz. He defeated Diaz by a 12-round unanimous decision on the One Championship main event for a One Championship, which is like a MMA and like kickboxing series over in Asia. Like it's actually the top mixed martial arts promotion in Asia. And has actually, signed Srisaket as almost like a special feature due to the notoriety that he's gained recently with his big victories over Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez and Juan Francisco Estrada, in bringing a major spotlight to, I guess, kind of mainland Asia as opposed to just like, say, Japan or the Philippines, which are, island nations as opposed to being on the mainland like Thailand is. And aside from that, Srisaket Rungvisai versus Iran Diaz was actually a very good fight. Diaz, honestly, I expected to get knocked out probably midway through the fight, just by virtue of the pressure and power that Srisaket has. In Srisaket's last fight, which was also kind of a showcase on a One Championship card against Young Gil Bay, he completely just obliterated Young Gil Bay in a round. Diaz, I felt like, would last longer than Gil Bay, though, just by virtue of his own class as a fighter. He's a guy that is a bit of a fringe contender as a flyweight to bantamweight or thereabouts. He's also a pretty big guy. He's a guy that's competed as high as I think super bantamweight, and the two times though that he did take a step up to like the higher level, well, it can be argued either way, because he does have victories over former champions Tyson Marquez and Luis Concepcion, which are very, very good wins. But at the same time, he also does have knockout losses to former WBC champion Juan Churritos Hernandez, as well as Nordin Ubali, who is one of the current WBC mandatories at bantamweight. He's one of the guys in the running to potentially fight for that title, although that's kind of a very tangled web as to whether he's actually going to fight for that championship or not, even though he was the next guy in line for Luis Neri in the midst of Neri getting stripped and the whole situation there. It's kind of a mess at bantamweight. But at super flyweight, Diaz still looms as a pretty tough, good competitor, although not necessarily somebody on the level of an Estrada or a Quadras or an Duran Lakas, somebody that you could necessarily say is like an elite at the division, super flyweight, bantamweight, thereabouts. But I do think that he showed quite a bit of toughness in the fight here against Srisaket. He actually managed to rock Srisaket a couple of times. I mean, it seemed like he was giving Srisaket some issues with the good footwork of himself and some of the good combinations that he was throwing. He was almost like doing like a bit of a Juan Estrada or Juan Manuel Marquez kind of impression. Marquez incidentally actually helped him train for this fight, and you could definitely see some of the tutelage in there. Interestingly enough, he's actually from the same city as Orlando Salido, and his style is not too dissimilar from Salido's, just in general, just kind of the way, the angles that which he throws his punches, albeit I think he's a little bit more defensively responsible than Salido has tended to be frequently throughout his career. But he did give Srisaket a little bit of trouble throughout the fight. Early on, Srisaket, he starts relatively quickly. He was hammering Diaz with some heavy shots, moving Diaz around the ring. He was clearly controlling the action in the early goings of it. But at the same time, he didn't necessarily look like he had that same sense of urgency as he's had in his recent fights against elite competition. Srisaket did look like somebody that may have taken this fight a little bit lightly. I think he's one of these guys that he kind of gets up for his opponents, and then if he's fighting a lesser opponent, maybe he's not really giving his all in training in that same regard. That's just the way that it appeared to me, because it did seem like Diaz was giving him a little bit of trouble with some of the movement that he was giving him. Although Srisaket, he was almost kind of like taking his time, wasn't necessarily forcing the action. But at the same time, just by virtue of him not necessarily forcing the action as he has frequently in his more recent fights, that's just the sense that I get, is that not necessarily that Diaz was making an impression on him, as opposed to Srisaket himself not necessarily rushing things because of the fact that he didn't necessarily train in that rugged mentality where it's like, oh, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to beat the crap out of this guy, get him out of there. That's it. That's all. It's going to be over with. He did hit Diaz with some heavy shots, though, and Diaz took them well. Diaz was starting to get back into the fight, though. I'd say around the fourth round, he landed some pretty heavy shots back on Srisaket. That's probably the first round that I personally gave to him. He was doing some kind of good back and forth with Srisaket a little bit there in spots, landing some pretty good combinations. So like not unlike some of the combinations that Estrada was able to land on Srisaket, albeit without the same defensive acuity of an Estrada to be able to avoid and evade the return fire that Srisaket was giving back to him. He talked about in the preview to this fight about trying to back Srisaket up and see how Srisaket fights going backwards, and I think he very quickly abandoned that plan of action just because of the fact that Srisaket, if you're trying to push him backwards, good luck with that because he's gonna push his punches right into you, and they're gonna be all the heavier for it. He's not a guy like like recently happened with Golovkin and Canelo, where Golovkin, when you smothered him, the power wasn't quite the same. Srisaket still has every bit of his power on the inside, even as you're trying to smother that. And I think just the fact that Srisaket is also the shorter guy of the two probably meant that Diaz's plan was kind of flawed to begin with as well. So it's like, him shortening up his punches wasn't that big of a deal because he's the shorter man anyway. He's the one that's going to be shooting the choppier, shorter shots in the first place. But Diaz, when he was boxing on the outside, was doing some pretty good work. He had a pretty good sixth round as well. That was kind of an even round. You could have given it to either guy. The seventh round, however, even though Srisaket was actually doing really good work, he did get caught with a mean uppercut from Diaz that honestly should have been counted as a knockdown. Jay Nady, the referee, counted it as a slip, so he didn't take any points away from Srisaket. But it was a clear punch. It was clear as day. You see, even like on the stream, the angle was just perfect. You see Srisaket land like two good shots, and as he was coming in, after landing that second left cross, Diaz hit him with just a picture-perfect right uppercut. And, who knows, maybe part of it was him slipping on the mat as well as getting hit by the punch, but at the end of the day, he got hit by the punch. He went down. That should have been counted as a knockdown. So I personally gave the seventh round to Diaz just like based off of that. The fact that, he ostensibly dropped his opponent. I didn't necessarily score at 10-8, but, to me that should have won him the round, in a round that was relatively close, although Srisaket I did think was getting slightly the better of the action overall. The eighth round, Srisaket did really well coming back, just kind of smacking Diaz around the ring, just the heavier puncher, the stronger puncher. Diaz was falling almost like into the same trap as a lot of Srisaket's opponents were, even though he found Srisaket a pretty open target to be able to potentially hit, even if not necessarily cleanly every single time. It's just that the fact that Srisaket, when he lands on you, even if he's not landing clean, he's moving you around the ring. So it's like that's gonna make such an impression, I think, on the fans, on the judges, and on the scores ultimately. That it's tough to overcome that level of brute force that the guy has. The ninth round, I thought that Diaz actually scored another knockdown that was called a slip by Jay Nady. Hit Srisaket this time with like an overhand right, and this time it actually looked a little bit more like Srisaket kind of did slip on the canvas, but at the same time, he did get hit by a punch. He did kind of like go down and touch glove. This one wasn't as bad as the first no knockdown call, but it's still one where honestly it should have been called a knockdown. Jay Nady, I think, didn't have his best night on this one. But otherwise, it was the ninth round was a bit closer though in terms of action than the seventh. I thought that Diaz was kind of fighting on even terms with Srisaket. Going into the final rounds though, and the unfortunate thing before I even mention the final rounds is, this fight was because of the fact that it's a WBC title fight and it was held outside of the United States. The WBC outside of the United States usually has open scoring, and so because of that, you could see that the judges had Srisaket way up after 4 rounds, and even further up after 8 rounds. They had him basically dominating the fight. So at that point, you could think like, well, Srisaket, maybe he'll coast, the last few rounds to an easy decision victory. But he did not coast. He went out there like really just firing away at Diaz for the last 4 rounds, and Diaz put up a great fight. Was landing, giving and returning and everything. But Srisaket ultimately, he was just landing the heavier shots. Diaz would sometimes land cleaner shots in certain rounds, but just the overall impact of Srisaket, and you could even see it in terms of the damage that was done. Towards the end of the fight, Diaz was bleeding over both eyes, out of his nose, and Srisaket definitely made a physical impression on the guy. Um, but I mean, as the rounds kind of told on to the end, Srisaket looked like he wanted to try to knock Diaz out, but Diaz overall, he's a tough guy. He got hurt a few different times. It looked like he might have been close to getting stopped on a couple of occasions, but he hanged in there. He was hanging in tough, and I think this was in part Srisaket taking Diaz lightly going into it. I don't think that he trained as hard for this fight as he has in his recent fights against more elite tier competition. But at the same time, I do think that Diaz was probably very much up for this fight because of the fact that he realized, like, hey, this is for a world title. This is a big opportunity that probably wouldn't have been afforded to him otherwise. And, he tried to make the most of it. And he fought a very good fight. But ultimately, he just didn't have the class or the caliber to be able to hang and actually defeat an opponent such as Srisaket. Maybe had he caught one of the other champions on an off night, he may have been able to beat him. Maybe a Yafai or an Ankas or somebody. But Srisaket, I do think, is on another level even compared to those guys. Although looking at this fight, though, I very much think that Estrada's gonna be clamoring for a rematch with Srisaket because I think his flaws were very much in full effect here. And I think even Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez might want another shot at Srisaket. And I'm sure Srisaket would like another shot at him, too, just by virtue of the name value that they bring at the lower weights and making it so that they can make more money than they could otherwise, at least outside of Asia. I think Srisaket's getting paid pretty well for these one championship title defenses over in Thailand. He's getting paid really nicely over there. And that's one of the good things, though, is the fact that, the more money that gets brought to the table from each guy individually, as well as the more players there are in the game, and now that HBO has bowed out completely of boxing, I think it just makes it actually that much more interesting to see exactly who's going to televise these guys. You've had Ankas headline a couple of times on ESPN now. You have Srisaket, with this YouTube live stream that they showed on the One Championship YouTube page internationally. You have DAZN out there doing their thing, and you have like the Golden Boy events that have been showcased on YouTube and Facebook and at various different times. So I'm actually just interested to see exactly how everything all plays out here. I think that because of the fact that Srisaket is getting paid even more handsomely to fight to make these defenses in Thailand on these One Championship YouTube cards. I think that anybody that potentially comes to the table to him with an offer, it's going to have to be a very good offer for him to actually want to leave Thailand and fight on one of these other networks in order to fight against an Estrada or a Chocolatito or an Ankas or a Yafai or an Inoue or whomever it might happen to be. And speaking of Inoue, of course, he's going to be defending his title tomorrow against Juan Carlos Payano. And, who knows? Maybe eventually we'll get an Inoue versus Srisaket fight, a fight that a lot of people have been clamoring for. And even in just the greater sphere of boxing, that's probably like the fight du jour for the sub-bantamweight classes that everybody really wants to see. Just two monster punchers facing off against each other, and let's see like exactly who's got more firepower and who's truly the king of the lighter weights, the Lord of the Flies, so to speak. I like my Twitter nickname. But solid win for Srisaket, albeit one that was semi-lackluster in compared to his previous wins. But at the same time, he wasn't fighting as illustrious a name. But also at the same time, his last fight against Young Gil Bay, he completely obliterated the guy, which is what we're expecting like an elite fighter to be able to do against lesser known opponents. Like he potentially should have done here against Diaz, since Diaz has two other fights where he was stopped by knockout. But other than that, hopefully we get Srisaket versus Estrada 2. That's the fight that I personally want to see. Chocolatito, I'm sure, potentially looms out there somewhere, just by virtue of name value. Who knows, maybe DAZN will be able to front up the money, or ESPN will be able to front up the money. Joran Akas was actually in the house watching Srisaket, so maybe he's actually truly interested. Maybe Bob Arum's looking to get into the Srisaket business, and potentially even feed Akas to him, and go after even the bigger star at super flyweight. Who knows, it all remains to be seen, but I think that's going to do it for this one, and I will catch you guys on the next one. Peace.